3 times a day. What the rancher did next changed history. Wild West stories. The wind carried the faint smell of dry grass, earth, and the lingering scent of last night's dew. Samuel Hayes, a man in his late 30s, already stood outside his modest wooden house, a worn hat perched firmly on his head. He breathed deeply, taking in the familiar sights of his ranch, the land that had been in his family for generations. His eyes moved over the fences that marked the borders of his fields, the water troughs that glimmered with the first light of morning, and the herd of cattle that stirred quietly in the distance. Life on the prairie was not easy, but Samuel knew it was honest work, the kind that shaped a man's character as much as it provided for him. From the moment he could remember, Samuel had loved the quiet rhythm of ranch life. Each morning he woke before the sun, moving with a purpose that only years of routine could build. By the time the first streaks of light appeared on the horizon, he had already fed the horses, checked the fences, and walked through the cattle pens to make sure every animal was healthy and accounted for. His neighbors often commented on his dedication, though some found his methods unusual. Unlike most ranchers, Samuel kept detailed records of everything. He noted how the cattle behaved, the growth of the grass, the condition of the soil, and even the smallest changes in the weather. He did this 3 times a day, at sunrise, noon, and sunset, believing that careful observation could reveal patterns that others might miss. Samuel's mornings were always the busiest. He began by walking along the perimeter of his land, eyes scanning for broken fences, signs of predators, or any cattle that seemed unwell. His boots made a soft crunching sound against the dry earth, and the faint whinny of a horse in the distance reminded him that every day on the ranch was a balance of responsibility and patience. He stopped occasionally to jot notes in his leather-bound journal, recording temperatures, wind directions, and the subtle changes in the grass. He knew that these small details mattered. In the past, ranchers had lost entire herds because they ignored the signs of drought or disease. Samuel refused to let that happen to his animals, or to the land he loved so dearly. By mid-morning, the sun had risen higher, painting the sky with shades of orange and gold. Samuel returned to his house to prepare a simple breakfast of eggs, bread, and coffee. He ate quietly, watching the distant hills where wild animals sometimes appeared. Rabbits darted among the bushes, and hawks circled lazily overhead. Every movement in the landscape caught Samuel's attention. He had learned that the land spoke to those who listened carefully. A change in the behavior of the birds, the dryness of the grass, or the way the river sparkled in the sunlight could all indicate what was to come. His neighbors laughed at his obsession, calling him the watchful one, but Samuel did not mind. He knew that understanding the land required patience, discipline, and the willingness to see what others ignored. After breakfast, Samuel saddled his horse, a sturdy chestnut named Daisy, and rode out to check on the far edges of his ranch. The wind picked up, rustling the tall grasses and carrying the faint scent of distant wildflowers. As he rode, he thought about the years his family had spent on this land, how his father had taught him to respect it, and how his grandfather had insisted on keeping records of every season, every rainfall, and every herd. Samuel felt a deep connection to that legacy, a sense of responsibility that went beyond simple survival. This land was more than property. It was a living, breathing entity that required attention and care. By noon, the sun was high and merciless, beating down on the open plains. Samuel found a shady spot under a lone oak tree and pulled out his journal again. He wrote carefully, noting the position of the sun, the movement of the clouds, and the behavior of his animals. He observed a few of the cows grazing lazily, their tails swishing to keep away flies, and a calf that seemed unusually restless. Every detail was important. Samuel believed that by paying attention to these small signs, he could anticipate problems before they became disasters. Today, he noted a slight browning of the grass near the riverbank, a detail that seemed minor but could indicate a lack of water if the trend continued. Most ranchers would have ignored it, but Samuel's habit of recording observations 3 times a day gave him an edge that others lacked. As the afternoon passed, Samuel continued his rounds, repairing a fence that had been damaged by a storm the week before. He worked with precision, knowing that a single break in the fence could allow cattle to wander and be lost forever. His hands were calloused, his clothes dusty, but he worked tirelessly, driven by a sense of duty. Even when the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the plains, Samuel did not rush. He understood that life on the ranch required patience and that rushing could lead to mistakes. Every nail he hammered, every post he set was done with care, guided by the knowledge that the smallest details mattered in the harsh reality of the Wild West. By late afternoon, Samuel returned to the main ranch house, his journal in hand. He paused for a moment to watch the sun dip toward the horizon, painting the sky with fiery reds and purples. The cattle had settled, and the wind had calmed, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. He felt a quiet satisfaction in the work he had done. Though the day had been long and demanding, he knew that his efforts were not in vain. By observing carefully and acting diligently, he had ensured the safety and well-being of his animals and the land. This sense of accomplishment was familiar, a steady companion in his solitary life on the prairie. As evening approached, Samuel sat on the porch of his house, sipping a cup of coffee and reflecting on the day. He thought about the importance of routine, the value of observation, and the lessons he had learned from generations before him. In his quiet moments, he often imagined what the future might hold, both for his ranch and for the larger world around him. He wondered how other ranchers would fare, especially those who ignored the subtle signs of nature. Samuel knew that the land had a rhythm, a way of speaking to those who listened, and he felt privileged to be among those who could hear it. Finally, as darkness fell and the stars began to shimmer in the vast sky, Samuel made his final entries in his journal for the day. His observations, recorded 3 times a day, were more than notes. They were a testament to his dedication, his care, and his understanding of the land. He knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and perhaps new surprises, but he faced the future with confidence. For Samuel Hayes, life on the ranch was not just about survival. It was about respect, diligence, and the quiet power of observation. And as he closed his journal, he felt ready for whatever the prairie had in store. The morning sun rose again over the wide plains, painting the grass with golden light. Samuel Hayes had already been awake for hours. The rancher's life left little room for idleness, and Samuel had a habit of rising before dawn, no matter the season. Today felt different, though. There was a quiet tension in the air, a subtle unease that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. As he stepped outside, the dry wind whispered across the land, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and distant wildflowers. Samuel's eyes scanned the horizon carefully, noticing little details that others might have missed. The grass near the riverbank, which had always been lush and green this time of year, now showed signs of browning. Patches of the earth were harder and cracked, indicating that moisture was slowly disappearing from the soil. Samuel frowned. He remembered the careful notes he had made yesterday, recording subtle changes in the land. He had been tracking weather patterns, soil conditions, and the behavior of his cattle for years, but this was the first time he noticed a worrying pattern that could not be ignored. The river that ran along the edge of his ranch was lower than usual, and the cattle seemed restless, moving from one patch of grass to another in search of food. Samuel mounted Daisy, his chestnut horse, and rode to check the far edges of the ranch. The wind had grown warmer, and the sun was higher in the sky, casting harsh shadows across the fields. He stopped at each water trough, testing the water levels and examining the cattle for signs of dehydration. One of the older cows, a gentle brown animal he had raised from a calf, showed signs of weakness. Its coat was dull, and it moved more slowly than usual. Samuel's heart sank. He knew that if the water continued to drop and the grass continued to dry, the ranch could face a crisis. But Samuel was not a man to panic. He believed in preparation, observation, and action. By mid-morning, Samuel returned to his house to record his observations in his journal. He noted the color of the grass, the temperature, the wind patterns, and the behavior of the animals. He wrote carefully, aware that these notes were more than mere habit. They were a record of survival, a tool that could help him predict the future. After finishing, he sat for a moment, sipping coffee and staring out at the dry landscape. Samuel knew that the signs he saw were only the beginning. The land had a way of testing those who relied on it. The coming weeks could be difficult, and he needed to act quickly. He decided to inspect the irrigation channels that his grandfather had built many years ago. The small canals ran through parts of the ranch, carrying water from the river to fields and pastures. Samuel had never relied solely on them, but now he realized their importance. He walked along the channels, checking for blockages and leaks, repairing cracks with careful hands. It was slow, tiring work, but necessary. As he worked, he noticed that the water flow was weaker than ever before. The drought that had been whispered about by a neighboring rancher last week was no longer a distant worry. It had arrived. By noon, Samuel had made some improvements to the irrigation system. He adjusted the flow to reach the areas where the grass was dying fastest, ensuring that the cattle would have at least some food and water. His journal entries that day were longer than usual, filled with observations, calculations, and careful plans. He wrote about the weather, noting the intensity of the sun, the direction of the wind, and the absence of rain. He marked which areas of the ranch were most vulnerable, which could survive with minimal water, and which would need immediate attention. This was no longer just routine. It was strategy, and Samuel knew that his ability to act quickly could determine whether the ranch survived or failed. In the late afternoon, Samuel rode to a neighboring ranch. Many of the local ranchers had dismissed the early signs of drought, believing that nature would correct itself. But Samuel had learned through experience that ignoring small problems often led to disaster. He approached Mr. Thompson, a man whose ranch was located just a few miles away, and spoke with him about the changing conditions. Thompson frowned and shook his head. "We've been through dry spells before," he said. "The rain will come soon enough. Don't worry so much." Samuel listened politely, but he could see the worry in Thompson's eyes. It was the same look he had seen on the faces of other ranchers when problems grew too big to ignore. Samuel explained the importance of preparation, the value of careful observation, and the benefits of irrigation. He showed Thompson his journal, explaining the notes he had made 3 times a day and the patterns he had noticed. Thompson remained skeptical, but Samuel's calm confidence and clear reasoning made an impression. "I'll think about it," Thompson said reluctantly. Samuel nodded, knowing that change often came slowly, even when the evidence was clear. Returning to his ranch, Samuel spent the evening making small improvements. He dug deeper into the soil near the water troughs, planting drought-resistant grass seeds that he had experimented with in previous years. He repaired fences, checked the cattle, and made additional notes in his journal. Every detail mattered. Even a small mistake or overlooked sign could turn into a serious problem in the harsh environment of the Wild West. By sunset, he paused for a moment on the porch, watching the horizon glow with orange and red hues. The day had been long and exhausting, but Samuel felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. He had taken steps to protect his land, his cattle, and his way of life. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly, leaving a cool breeze across the plains. Samuel lit a small lantern and sat down with his journal once more. He reviewed the day's entries carefully, thinking about what he had learned and what he needed to do tomorrow. He reflected on the importance of diligence, observation, and planning. The drought was a threat, but Samuel had tools, knowledge, and determination on his side. By recording his observations 3 times a day, he was creating a system that could guide him through even the harshest conditions. Before going to bed, Samuel walked among the cattle one last time. The animals were calmer now, thanks to the water and food he had provided. He patted the older cow gently, whispering words of reassurance. In his mind, Samuel was already planning the next steps: how to further improve irrigation, how to protect the grass, and how to help neighboring ranchers who might not be ready for the challenges ahead. The quiet ranch was peaceful under the starry sky, but Samuel knew that peace was fragile. The coming days would test everyone's resilience, patience, and wisdom. Finally, Samuel returned to his home, extinguished the lantern, and climbed into bed. The sounds of the prairie at night, the gentle rustle of grass, distant calls of coyotes, and the soft snorts of cattle filled the air. Samuel closed his eyes, thinking about the importance of observation, preparation, and foresight. He understood that surviving in the Wild West required more than strength or courage. It required attention to detail, careful planning, and the willingness to act when others hesitated. As he drifted into sleep, he felt ready for the challenges to come, determined to face them with the same patience, skill, and diligence that had guided him all his life. The sun rose weakly over the prairie, its light struggling to cut through the haze of dust that hung in the air. Samuel Hayes had already been awake for hours, his mind restless and focused on the challenges ahead. The drought that he had predicted was now no longer a distant concern. It had fully arrived. The grass that had once stretched green and lush across the ranch was now brittle and yellowed. Streams and small ponds had shrunk into muddy puddles, leaving the cattle restless and thirsty. Even the trees, tall and strong just a month ago, looked tired under the unrelenting sun. Samuel knew that this was a test of everything he had learned about the land, and he refused to be defeated. Mounting Daisy, he rode out to check the farthest edges of his property. His boots pressed into the hard, cracked soil, and the wind whipped across his face. Each step he took reminded him that survival was no longer guaranteed. The cattle were uneasy, moving slowly from one patch of dry grass to another. Samuel stopped by the older cow that had shown signs of weakness days ago. The animal's breathing was shallow, and its coat hung loosely on its frame. Samuel knelt beside it, checking for signs of dehydration. His heart sank, but he refused to show fear. Panic could spread faster than drought ever could. By mid-morning, Samuel had visited every corner of the ranch, carefully noting the state of the grass, the water levels, and the condition of his animals. He wrote diligently in his journal, which had now become more than a habit. It was his lifeline. Each entry included details about temperature, wind, cloud patterns, and the behavior of the cattle. He also recorded subtle signs that others might ignore: the color of the soil near the river, the dryness of certain types of grass, and the movements of birds searching for water. These notes were critical. They were the map by which he would navigate this growing crisis. Samuel knew that the problem was bigger than his own ranch. The neighboring lands were suffering as well. On his ride to check the fences, he saw fields that had once been fertile now turning brown and brittle. The sight of struggling animals on other ranches made his chest tighten. Some ranchers had begun to sell off cattle at lower prices, desperate to save what little they could. Samuel understood their fear, but he also knew that acting in panic would only make the problem worse. He needed a strategy, and he needed to implement it carefully and decisively. By noon, Samuel returned to the house to rest briefly and take stock of his supplies. Water barrels were lower than he had hoped, and some of the cattle were showing early signs of fatigue. Samuel began to make a detailed plan. He divided the ranch into sections, prioritizing the areas with the healthiest grass and water sources. He decided to feed the weaker cattle first, moving them closer to water troughs and protecting the grass in other areas for the stronger animals. This way, he could maximize survival. He also considered expanding the small irrigation canals he had repaired earlier. It would be hard work, but it could save the ranch. The afternoon brought more challenges. The sun burned down on the plains, making the ground shimmer with heat. Samuel rode to a small hill to survey the ranch from above. From this vantage point, the full extent of the drought became clear. Dust rose in small clouds across the fields, and even the usually calm river had slowed to a mere trickle. Samuel realized that if he did not act quickly, entire herds could be lost, and the land itself could become irreparably damaged. He made another note in his journal. The drought was worsening faster than expected, and new strategies would be required. Samuel spent the late afternoon digging additional channels to bring water from the river to the most critical areas. Each scoop of soil was heavy in his hands, and sweat poured down his face. Daisy stood patiently nearby, waiting as her rider worked tirelessly. Samuel was not alone in his determination, though he did most of the work himself. His neighbors watched from a distance, unsure if his efforts could succeed. Samuel did not mind. He knew that survival required action, not approval. Every hour mattered, and he moved with precision, ensuring that the water would reach the parts of the ranch that needed it most. By evening, Samuel had made significant progress, but the struggle was far from over. He returned to the house, exhausted but resolute. The cattle were calmer near the new water channels, drinking steadily and finding relief from the heat. Samuel took a long moment to breathe, feeling a quiet satisfaction in his work. Despite the challenges, he had made a difference. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky glowed with reds and purples, but the beauty of the sunset could not mask the seriousness of the situation. The drought had changed the landscape and challenged every rancher in the region. Night fell, and with it came a quiet that was both comforting and unsettling. Samuel lit a lantern and returned to his journal. Tonight's entry was longer than usual, filled with observations, calculations, and reflections. He wrote about the state of the cattle, the distribution of water, and the health of the land. He noted which irrigation channels had worked best, and which areas still required attention. He also began to think about the future, considering ways to help neighboring ranchers who might be struggling even more than he was. Samuel believed that sharing knowledge was just as important as protecting his own property. Sleep came late for Samuel that night, and even then, his dreams were filled with dry fields, thirsty cattle, and the constant movement of the wind across the prairie. He dreamed of water flowing freely again, of grass turning green, and of the herds growing strong. More than anything, he dreamed of solutions. Samuel had always believed that careful observation, thoughtful planning, and hard work could overcome almost any challenge. The drought was testing that belief, but he refused to let it defeat him. He knew that with patience and determination, the ranch could survive, and perhaps even thrive. The next morning, Samuel rose once more before dawn. He moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb Daisy, who nuzzled him gently as he prepared for the day. He dressed quickly and stepped outside, feeling the familiar crunch of dry soil beneath his boots. The morning air was still hot and dry, but Samuel welcomed it. Every day brought new challenges, yes, but also new opportunities to act, to learn, and to make a difference. His habit of recording observations 3 times a day gave him a steady rhythm, a way to measure progress, and a method to anticipate problems before they became disasters. Samuel spent the entire day implementing more strategies. He moved weaker cattle to areas with the most water, protected grass for future feeding, and reinforced fences that had been damaged by the restless animals. He experimented with new techniques to keep water from evaporating too quickly, covering troughs and creating small windbreaks to slow the hot air. Each action was a careful calculation, based on the observations he had recorded over the past weeks. Samuel was not taking risks blindly. He was acting with knowledge, experience, and foresight. By late afternoon, the first small signs of hope appeared. Some of the grass near the irrigation channels had begun to recover slightly, and the cattle were calmer and more energetic. Samuel felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his hard work was making a difference. However, he also knew that the drought was far from over, and that the coming days would bring new challenges. Samuel's mind was already planning the next steps: how to conserve water, how to protect the weakest animals, and how to prepare for the possibility that rain might not come soon. As the sun set and the sky turned deep orange, Samuel made his final entries in the journal for the day. Each note was meticulous, recording not just what he saw, but what he thought, what he learned, and what he planned to do next. These observations would guide him, and perhaps others, through the uncertain days ahead. Samuel Hayes, the quiet rancher who had always followed his own methods, had become more than a man tending his land. He had become a strategist, a caretaker, and a problem solver. And though the drought had brought struggle, it had also revealed the strength, resilience, and wisdom that Samuel carried quietly within him. Finally, under the vast star-filled sky, Samuel walked among his cattle one last time. He checked their water, adjusted their feeding arrangements, and spoke softly to each animal, reassuring them as if they could understand every word. Then, tired but unwavering, he returned home, extinguished the lantern, and climbed into bed. Outside, the prairie was silent except for the soft rustle of grass in the wind and the distant call of a night bird. Samuel closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of challenges, but also another day to act, to protect, and to survive. He had faced the drought head-on, and through careful observation and decisive action, he had begun to turn the tide. The days had grown longer and harsher on the prairie. The drought showed no mercy, and Samuel Hayes felt the weight of responsibility heavier than ever. Every morning before the sun had fully risen, he was already on horseback, riding across his ranch to check the water sources, the cattle, and the state of the grass. His journal, filled with careful observations, had become a record of survival, a guide for action, and a testament to the lessons he had learned from years of living with the land. Yet, despite all his planning, he knew that survival depended not just on one ranch, but on the wider community. The drought was a shared challenge, and Samuel realized that it would require more than his own efforts to overcome. One morning, as the sun rose over the dusty plains, Samuel noticed something alarming. The river, which had managed to flow slowly for weeks, had almost completely dried in certain areas. The remaining water was muddy, barely enough to sustain his cattle. He quickly dismounted Daisy and knelt beside one of the water troughs, measuring the remaining supply and checking for leaks. His journal that day would be the longest yet, filled with meticulous notes, sketches of the irrigation channels, and careful calculations. Every detail mattered: the survival of his ranch, and potentially the survival of neighboring farms, depended on it. Samuel knew he could no longer keep his methods to himself. Over the past weeks, he had quietly shared advice with a few neighbors, but many still doubted him. Some had sold off their herds in desperation, while others had begun abandoning parts of their land, believing that nothing could save them. Samuel felt a growing sense of urgency. He decided it was time to bring the community together, to share not just observations but actionable strategies that could prevent disaster. With Daisy saddled and his journal in hand, he set out to visit the nearby town, carrying hope, knowledge, and determination. As he rode into town, Samuel could see the effects of the drought all around him. Fields that had once been full of crops now lay brown and cracked. Animals roamed restlessly, searching for grass and water that no longer existed. Families whispered fears about the coming months, worried that the harsh season would leave them with nothing. Samuel dismounted outside the general store, greeting neighbors with a calm, steady smile. "The land is telling us something," he said quietly, holding up his journal. "We need to listen and act before it's too late." At first, the townspeople were hesitant. Many were skeptical of Samuel's methods, believing that no man could fight nature. But Samuel's confidence and clarity were hard to ignore. He gathered them in the town hall, spreading out his journal and sketches across a large table. He explained the observations he had made 3 times a day for weeks, showing the patterns he had discovered in rainfall, soil moisture, and cattle behavior. He described how small changes in irrigation, careful rationing of water, and the protection of vital grasslands could make a difference. Slowly, the townspeople began to listen, and slowly, hope began to replace doubt. Samuel did not just talk, he demonstrated. He led a group of ranchers and farmers to his land, showing them the irrigation channels he had repaired and expanded. He taught them how to monitor water levels, how to prioritize feeding weaker animals, and how to protect grass for the coming weeks. The work was difficult, and the sun was relentless, but Samuel's steady guidance inspired confidence. People began to see that the situation, while dire, could be managed with careful planning and action. For the first time since the drought began, the community felt a sense of control. As days passed, Samuel's efforts began to bear fruit. Grass in key areas of his ranch and nearby fields showed signs of recovery, and the cattle, though still cautious, grew stronger. Other ranchers followed his advice, repairing canals, rationing water, and moving animals strategically. Samuel continued his routine of 3 daily observations, recording every small success and setback in his journal. Each entry became a guide not just for himself, but for the entire community. His careful attention to detail, combined with practical action, was changing the way people managed the land, and it was saving lives. The most critical moment came one afternoon when Samuel received news from a neighboring ranch. The family there had been struggling for days, with water nearly gone and cattle at risk. Samuel did not hesitate. He mounted Daisy and rode swiftly across the dry, dusty plains. Along the way, he assessed the land, noting which areas could be saved with immediate attention. When he arrived, he worked tirelessly with the ranchers, repairing broken fences, redirecting water from nearby channels, and teaching them how to conserve resources. By nightfall, the immediate crisis had been averted. The ranchers looked at Samuel with gratitude and awe, realizing that his methods, his careful observations and decisive action, had truly made a difference. Word of Samuel's success spread quickly. Farmers and ranchers from neighboring counties began visiting his land, eager to learn the techniques that had saved his ranch and helped others. Samuel welcomed them all, patiently demonstrating his methods, explaining the importance of daily observations, and showing how small, thoughtful actions could prevent disaster. People began to adopt these practices, and slowly, a system of drought management began to form. What had started as one man's careful routine had become a model for an entire region. Samuel often reflected on how something as simple as observing the land 3 times a day had led to such profound change. His routine, which some had once thought odd or unnecessary, was now the cornerstone of survival for many families. He realized that knowledge, when combined with action, could transform lives. The drought remained a challenge, but the fear that had once paralyzed the community was being replaced by determination, collaboration, and practical solutions. Samuel's leadership was quiet but powerful, showing that even a single individual, when guided by observation and care, could influence the course of history. Evenings were still long and tiring, but Samuel found a quiet satisfaction in his work. After checking the cattle and water channels, he would sit on the porch with his journal, reviewing the day's observations and planning for tomorrow. The land, though harsh and unforgiving, had become a partner in his efforts. Each new entry in the journal reflected a small victory, a patch of grass that had survived, a water source that had been conserved, a herd that had been saved. Samuel knew that the real reward was not in recognition or praise, but in the quiet knowledge that lives and livelihoods were being protected. As the weeks passed, Samuel's influence grew. Townspeople began to organize their own efforts, inspired by his methods. Meetings were held to share observations, discuss strategies, and coordinate the use of water and resources. Samuel continued to travel between ranches, offering guidance and support wherever it was needed. His habit of meticulous observation and careful planning became a model for the entire region. Families who had once feared losing everything now felt a renewed sense of hope and control. Samuel's simple routine of recording details 3 times a day had evolved into a movement, helping an entire community survive one of the harshest droughts they had ever faced. Through it all, Samuel remained humble. He did not seek recognition or reward. His satisfaction came from seeing the land thrive again, the cattle grow strong, and families regain their confidence. He understood that true leadership was not about power or status. It was about knowledge, action, and the willingness to help others. The drought had tested him, but it had also revealed the impact that a single, determined individual could have. Samuel Hayes, the quiet rancher who had once simply recorded observations out of habit, had become a symbol of hope and resilience. By the end of Part 4, Samuel's actions had begun to change the history of his region. What started as careful observation on his ranch had grown into a community-wide effort, saving countless lives and livelihoods. The land slowly began to recover, the cattle grew stronger, and the townspeople learned that preparation, diligence, and knowledge could overcome even the harshest challenges. Samuel's story was no longer just about survival. It was about leadership, foresight, and the quiet power of observation. The first light of dawn stretched across the prairie, casting long shadows over the fields and cattle that Samuel Hayes had worked so hard to protect. The air was crisp, and for the first time in many weeks, it carried a sense of promise rather than tension. Samuel rose early, as always, stepping outside his small wooden house to take in the sight of the ranch he had nurtured through the worst drought in decades. The grass, though not yet fully green, showed the first signs of recovery. The river, once reduced to a trickle, flowed steadily through the fields, feeding the pastures and giving life to the land once more. Samuel's mornings had returned to their familiar rhythm of observation, feeding the cattle and repairing fences, but there was a difference now. The community had learned from his example. Neighbors arrived daily, some bringing tools, others offering advice, and all eager to help one another. Samuel welcomed them, quietly teaching them new ways to monitor water, ration resources, and protect the land. The principles that had guided him, careful observation, patience, and action, were now spreading far beyond his own ranch. The region, once gripped by fear and uncertainty, was beginning to thrive. By mid-morning, Samuel visited a nearby farm that had struggled during the drought. The family greeted him with smiles and gratitude. Their fields, which had been brown and dry, were now dotted with green shoots, evidence of Samuel's guidance and the community's hard work. Samuel inspected their irrigation channels, offering small adjustments and advice. "It's about observing carefully and acting quickly," he said, pointing to a water trough that needed reinforcement. "Even small actions can make a big difference if you pay attention." The family nodded, understanding that survival required both knowledge and diligence. Back on his own ranch, Samuel recorded his observations in his journal, just as he had every day for weeks. The entries were longer than ever, filled not only with practical details about the land, cattle, and water levels, but also with reflections on the lessons learned during the drought. Samuel understood that his journal was more than a personal record. It was a guide for the future, a source of wisdom that could help others avoid the mistakes and hardships he had witnessed. His habit of observing 3 times a day had saved not just his ranch, but entire communities, and he wanted to ensure that the knowledge endured. As the sun climbed higher, Samuel walked among his cattle, patting each one gently and checking their health. The animals were calmer and stronger than they had been during the drought, moving confidently across the recovering fields. Samuel smiled, feeling a sense of pride and relief. The work had been difficult, exhausting, and often uncertain, but the results were clear. The ranch, once threatened by the harshest season in living memory, was now thriving. But Samuel knew that the real achievement was not just the survival of his cattle or the recovery of his land. It was the knowledge and preparation he had shared with others, creating a lasting system that would benefit generations to come. In the afternoons, Samuel often met with other ranchers and farmers to discuss strategies for the future. Together, they reviewed the successes and failures of the past weeks, sharing observations and adjusting plans for the coming months. Samuel encouraged everyone to continue recording their observations 3 times a day, just as he had done. He explained that this discipline, combined with careful planning, could prevent disaster and allow the land to flourish even in difficult times. The community began to see Samuel not just as a rancher, but as a teacher and guide. His calm wisdom, practical solutions, and attention to detail inspired confidence and respect. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows across the plains, Samuel rode to the town to attend a community meeting. Farmers and ranchers had gathered to celebrate their collective progress, sharing stories of recovery and resilience. Samuel spoke quietly but firmly, emphasizing the importance of preparation, observation, and mutual support. "We survived because we paid attention to the land and each other," he said. "Knowledge is powerful, but only when we use it. We must continue to observe, learn, and act together." The room filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. Samuel's leadership had transformed fear into action, uncertainty into confidence, and despair into hope. In the evenings, Samuel returned home, exhausted but content. He would sit on his porch, watching the sun set over the plains, and reflect on the journey that had brought him here. He thought of the cattle he had saved, the neighbors he had helped, and the land that had endured because of careful attention and timely action. He also thought of the lessons he had learned himself. That resilience came from preparation, that leadership came from service, and that even the smallest habits, like observing 3 times a day, could create profound change. As the weeks turned into months, the land continued to recover. Grass grew taller and greener, rivers flowed steadily, and the herds of cattle grew stronger. Samuel's efforts had ensured not only the survival of his own ranch, but also the well-being of the entire region. Families who had once feared losing everything now felt hope and confidence. Schools, markets, and towns that had been affected by the drought began to flourish once again. The lessons Samuel had taught, careful observation, shared knowledge, and strategic action, became a permanent part of the community's approach to ranching and farming. Samuel often walked along the riverbanks in the early morning, reflecting on how far things had come. He remembered the fear and uncertainty of the drought's early days, the exhaustion of long hours spent repairing fences and digging channels, and the worry for the weaker animals and struggling neighbors. Yet he also remembered the satisfaction of small victories, the first patch of grass that survived, the first cow to regain strength, the first neighbor to adopt his methods successfully. Each of these moments reminded him that persistence, knowledge and care could overcome even the harshest challenges. In time, Samuel's story spread beyond the local towns. Other ranchers and farmers came to learn from him, eager to adopt his methods and insights. Samuel welcomed them all, teaching with patience and humility. His careful system of observation, daily planning, and community collaboration became a model for others facing similar challenges. People began to understand that even ordinary routines, when combined with knowledge and action, could create extraordinary results. Samuel had turned a personal habit into a legacy that would influence generations of ranchers and farmers. As evening fell over the plains, Samuel stood at the edge of his land, watching the stars appear in the vast sky. The ranch was thriving, the community was resilient, and the cattle were strong. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. The fear of drought, the struggle to protect his land, the long days and nights spent observing, recording, and acting. He realized that true success was not measured only by survival, but by the positive impact one could have on others and on the world around them. Samuel's quiet diligence, his habit of careful observation 3 times a day, had changed the course of history for his community. Before going to bed, Samuel walked among the cattle one last time. He checked the water, adjusted feeding arrangements, and spoke softly to each animal as if they could understand him. The herd was calm, strong, and thriving. Samuel felt a deep sense of fulfillment. His work was done, and yet it was never truly finished. The land and the animals required constant care, attention, and respect. But Samuel also knew that the lessons he had learned and shared with others would endure far beyond his lifetime. Finally, Samuel returned to his house and sat at his desk. He opened his journal, filled with pages of observations, calculations, and reflections. He read through the entries, marveling at how a simple habit, observing the land 3 times a day, had grown into a system that saved lives, preserved the land, and united a community. The journal was more than a record. It was a testament to resilience, wisdom, and the quiet power of diligence. Samuel closed it with a sense of peace, knowing that the knowledge it contained would guide others for years to come. As he lay in bed that night, the prairie silent except for the whisper of the wind through the grass and the distant calls of animals settling for the night, Samuel felt a quiet pride. He had faced the harshest challenges nature could offer, protected his cattle and land, and helped his neighbors survive. Through patience, observation, and thoughtful action, he had turned crisis into opportunity, fear into hope, and ordinary routines into extraordinary results. Samuel Hayes, the quiet rancher of the Wild West, had left a legacy that would be remembered for generations. A legacy of care, diligence, and the remarkable power of paying attention to the world around you.